Hello, my beautiful friends, and welcome back to Beautifully Broken. My name is Sabby, and if you don't know who I am, I started a YouTube channel called Beautifully Broken over a year ago, where I started giving tips, guidance, tools, and knowledge on how we can better understand ourselves, our past and present stories, and in doing so, we can help heal our mental health. I help others gain a deeper understanding of themselves so that they can heal what needs to be healed in order to move forward into a happier sense of self. I believe that in looking back at the traumas, emotional wounds, and old narratives we carry, that we learn what needs to be healed in order to better our mental health. Welcome back, everyone, to Beautifully Broken. Today I have an interview with a very close friend of mine that I have known for a very, very long time, since I was a little one. Her name is Dulcinea Contreras, and she'll be speaking on her journey with mental health and, her experience with it. And it will be a bit more of a unique take, which I feel like a different perspective sometimes is what we need to connect.
Hello, everyone. My name is Dulcinea Contreras, and I am an associate marriage family therapist and an associate professional clinical counselor in the state of California. And I'm also a wellness coach. And so on a professional clinical level, as well as a more coach level, helping individuals to understand their obstacles and identify their next steps to create a goal. The continuum of what that looks like, it may be very much a mental health journey, how to overcome anxiety, depression, codependency. It may be very clinical related issues, or it may be very much of a career goal oriented wellness, like mental, spiritual, emotional, physical, and overall wellness goal plan. So it really is a range of different clients that I'm working with today. Of course, Sabi and I have known each other for years. And I was so fortunate to work with her and her family when I was working more as a spiritual counselor. I want to say like maybe 15 plus years ago.
Mm-hmm.
So I'm really adept at bringing in the spiritual piece, since we are spiritual essence in a body, into my work. So that's one of the unique offerings that I incorporate into my wellness coaching today. And so I really have a vast experience. I've worked from hospice in mental health all the way to prenatal, postnatal, new mommies with new babies. So really from birth to death, the whole continuum, helping people transition to the other side, and then welcoming new little ones who've just entered, and then bringing in support for their families. So that's been my clinical journey. And I really just love connecting with people. I feel like it's really important. And how I arrived at this place in my journey is from a very young age. I was very curious about my family and the way that they acted. And of course, I had a pretty dysfunctional family, and mine was pretty highly dysfunctional. So by age 5, I started writing letters to God, which was not a religious God, but it was like where I came from, God. And then fast forward from 5, I did that from 5 to 10. By age 10, I manifested my dad out of the house, which was literally like an everyday prayer journal entry. My mom was like, I don't understand what happened. And I just was like, well, I know what happened. I got that guy out of here. He was very toxic. Yeah, he was a toxic man, and not a bad person, great guy, like good heart, hard worker, had some great human attributes, but just was in a lot of pain and really wounded, and was projecting his wounded inner child onto everyone and everything. And it was very excruciating for us as a family, and then for me as a young woman. I was raised in a cultured family also, so the impact of a toxic person in a cultured family, it becomes like a group identity versus an individualistic family. So being in that very cultured group identity experience, having one family member be so off the charts unhealthy really hindered like me, my mom, my my brother, my grandparents, all of us were impacted because we all had this sense of identity that was overlapping. That was a 10. And then by 15, I started just asking my mom to take me to the bookstore. I knew that there was like ways for me to find answers to the questions I had that could help me understand what I had experienced for those first 10 years that were so just tragic and traumatic and hurtful, and just so many other human experiences that I'm sure your audience can relate to. And so by 15, I began going to the bookstore, and I think one of the first books that I picked out was Codependent No More by Melody Beattie. And then I also picked out a lot of poetry books. There was a lot of poetry that could explain what I was going through. And then I realized that I wanted some kind of like actual guide on the journey. And so I went without my parents knowing, which in California is completely legal. From 12 and older, any 12-year-old or older can go to a therapist, and the therapist can see them without ever divulging legally to the parents that they're in therapy with them, as long as the financial agreement is made between the therapist and the 12 or older individual. Mm-hmm. So by 15, I had put myself into therapy with a marriage family therapist. And oddly enough, or cool enough, she and I still have a connection, and she retired just a couple years ago. So from when I was age 15 into my middle adulthood, I had one marriage family therapist.
Wow.
That was steady. Pretty spectacular, right?
That's awesome. Yeah, I think I know. Actually, our therapist, we've known her for, God, a very, very long time too.
Yeah, it's when you're on a journey to wellness and to wholeness, if you can find one healthy attachment and really embrace all of the healthiness of that attachment, that one individual's attachment can negate and transform and override any other negative healthy attachments. Mm-hmm. So for me, this was like an answer to my prayers. It was like a miracle for me to have found at 15 a woman who literally explained to me very basic common sense things that were not taught to me whatsoever in my highly dysfunctional family. So I was able to learn about self-care, enmeshment, codependency. Some of these attributes, too, I just want to be clear, were part of just being in a cultured family.
Can you expand on what you mean by a cultured family?
Is someone with a collectivistic cultural background. So I'll give you some examples. So there's individualistic and there's collectivistic. Collectivistic would be people who function as a unit. So Italians, Mexicans, Hispanic, Middle Eastern families, Asian families. You always, it's very easy to identify because the group, there's just a strong sense of group identity. Like you mess with me, you mess with my family.
Yeah.
Right there. That's like one of the key, and you see that not only in, collectivistic cultures, there's also a socioeconomic status component to that kind of thinking, but typically it's very easily identified. So being in a collectivistic culture, I was able to go into this therapist at 15 when I was literally forming my identity, and she was able to help me unweave like who my dad was, who my mom was, who my brother was, who my grandparents were, and then who I was, which was, in a sense, I didn't even understand that I was separate from all of them. So if something happened to them, I would process it as an individual, as if it happened to me.
Yeah.
And that from a clinical framework is a codependent response. But culturally, that's also what a healthy collectivistic cultural norm. So it's like I had to learn in my own process and how to discern and unweave and look at the situations before me and go, okay, is that just a cultural norm in our family? And that's healthy because that's actually a cultural norm and it doesn't create dysfunction for me. Or I'd have to look at an experience and go, wait, that is completely codependent, and it is a cultural norm, but it's a codependent cultural norm that creates dysfunction for every one of us. It's
Yeah.
not good for any of us. But I had to start with understanding what my cultural norm of my family was, and then identifying what was codependent within that, and then learn how to not exhibit and not create relationships and friendships and work relationships that were codependent, because that was a huge piece of my cultural upbringing.
And so when you struggled with codependency, how did you get through it? What were some of the key moments? You bought that book, Codependent No More, and you
Yes.
had a therapist that you could go to, but what were some other like moments where I know I had to go to CODA meetings, and that was like an eye-opening thing for me. I don't know.
So for me, I handled it through, I'm a very intellectual, I love books, so I'm a book nerd. So I handled it through books. So I just decided, once I figured out codependence was a piece of my family puzzle that just didn't work for me, I began researching like every possible book. And then my therapist, of course, started giving me tools and building my toolbox. And she started also on going through like beliefs. So if something happened to your brother, that did not happen to you.
Yeah.
And I was like, oh, that's so simple. But when I was actually experiencing it, like if my brother got in a car accident, I would respond as if I got in a car accident.
Oh, wow.
And then I'd go into therapy, and I'd be like a mess and emotional and upset and distraught and traumatized. And she'd be like, wait a minute, you didn't even go through the car accident. Like, why are you responding like this? And I'm like, because it's my brother. Like, I love him more than anyone. Like, don't you know? Like, what's wrong with you, lady? Like, I mean, I didn't understand where she was coming from. It was like, there was a book called Boundaries by Anne Catherine. That was the next book that she presented to me. And that book was life-changing. So I still have that book. I recommend that book to clients. I recommend it to everyone. It's a very small book. And the book Boundaries really taught me when it was okay to have a layer of connection with another person, but then not actually process what happened to them, with them, for them, or need them to help me process what happened to me, what's for me and through me. And that's really, that second part is really the key component as an individual. So I'm going to reiterate that point is, so for myself in that codependent cultural piece, me recognizing that I had to process my relationship, and I had to process my friendships, and I had to process the betrayals within my relationships or my friendships or my family or my work or teachers or whoever, whatever was coming across my path. Because in the cultural formation of collectivism, and then also in codependence, you help others process their stuff, they help you process your stuff, and then no one's really responsible for anything. There's no level of accountability because you're all just helping each other process. And wow, that sounds great theoretically. It's very unhealthy because there's never a responsibility and accountability piece. And that accountability and responsibility piece is actually what creates inner freedom.
Can you explain a moment where that inner accountability and that sense of freedom really kind of pushed your buttons a little bit and you had to kind of figure out a way to get through it?
Yes. So I would say, so one of the first experiences I had was, so I'm in therapy with this marriage family therapist that I sought out at 15. And I come in this week and I'm talking to her and talking to her and talking to her. And she said, so are you here for you, or are you here for this person? And I was like, what? And what she was really asking me is, you've talked about this other person who you've been in a relationship with this entire 30 minutes when really you're not. And I'm not here to really help you. Like, I'm not here to help them. I'm here to help you.
Yeah.
And I was like, I really truly in my whole heart, I was almost offended because that's how codependent I was. I was like, wait a minute. why aren't you willing to talk about them? Like, that's my problem. Like, that's why I'm here, like in my mind. And what she was saying is talking about him isn't going to help you in any way. I mean, if there's one situation or one circumstance or one experience you need to hash out for your own process, that's an awesome thing that she could support. But that's not what I was doing. And so she made me very clear that it was literally a light bulb moment for me of like, she's basically redirecting you to you or redirecting me to me versus me talking about him. She wanted me to talk about myself.
So when you do have those moments in codependency where you are not, like you said, you need someone to redirect you to you, but you can't rely on someone to do that. How do you find your own moments to reconnect you to you?
So that's a great question. And I'd say the first step is the awareness. So what she did for me was made me aware, hey, you're not really here for you in this moment, and you have no idea about that. So I'm going to help you. So she brought in my awareness that it was not about myself at that moment. She redirected me to myself. And when she did, my feelings and my tears and my emotions emerged. And so once she brought up the awareness, then I was able to allow all that I was stuffing down by just focusing on him to emerge. That was a turning point in my entire life that, I mean, literally I've never processed. I've processed differently relationships since that moment. And I always ask myself, wait, is this about you or is this about him? Are you processing for him? Or are you processing for you? So it was a moment of awareness. And then once you are able to grab that awareness, whether it's through therapy or through a book or through a CODA meeting or through just a great friend that you can have that relationship with, or through a wellness coach like myself, however you can tap into that, then it's almost something that will automatically start to move in. It will start to move in each time. The awareness will come in, the consciousness will come in. And of course, we're humans, so sometimes we'll circle around several times, maybe even for several years. But each time there's an increased awareness. And of course, like anything, the more you work your muscle of awareness and consciousness of those codependent patterns, the more that you're able to then release them.
That's amazing. And to tie into that does bring in spirituality as well, of being present here and now and following your own self, your own identity, your own truth. How did that tie into you getting into the more spiritual side of things, along with codependency and everything?
So, okay, so that's a great question. So I'll say that from there, I went to, so from the Boundaries book and that experience and that question and that moment that day with her, I went into a book called Healing Your Inner Child by Charles Whitfield, I believe. He's an MD, and he wrote the book called Healing Your Inner Child. Oh, I don't know, probably in the 70s or 80s. It's an older book. And his take in this book is from the perspective of a dysfunctional family, and he uses the dysfunctional piece as alcoholism, because that was, I think, the framework he was writing from. And I, of course, didn't have alcoholism in my family, but I had other similar patterns. So I was very easily able to understand what he was saying and then apply it to my own circumstance. That book, I can't even tell you how many times I've given that book away for a friend to read, and then I don't get it back, and the book appears to me again. If that doesn't say something about the spiritual piece, I don't know what does. So I probably am on my, no joke, 8th to 10th copy of that book. Like different book, but same exact book, but physically a different book. And so that book literally takes you into the deepest part of yourself, which includes the spiritual piece. And so it incorporates, and of course, because he wrote on alcoholism, he brought in the AA principles, which very much incorporates the spiritual piece of who you are. The whole foundation of AA and CODA and all of those support groups that I find are very, very meaningful to people who really dive into them. and embrace them from a clinical perspective. So he uses those principles, and in those principles, my spirituality started emerging. And then ironically, at the same time, personally, my mom's best friend lost her husband
Oh, wow.
unexpectedly. So I began traveling to the Bay Area and staying with her for periods of time as I could. I was young, but I was just out of high school. And so I was able to, like, do my work up north or whatever. And I would stay with her for periods of times. And she was obviously in deep grief, deep despair, and deeply searching for meaning. And so she was attending grief therapy, grief support groups, individual therapy, and other, I think, grief share. She had many different support groups she created for herself. And so she and I together were like on this parallel journey of seeking our spiritual selves. And I was able to mirror to her, a young woman really searching to understand who she is, what she is, why she's here, and how to be whole and well to align with that.
Mm-hmm.
And she was mirroring for me someone who was in deep search for meaning because of deep loss. And I mean, I'll never forget, she said to me, so I'll give you an example of one of our conversations. So we're sitting in her house in the backyard in the Bay Area, and it's gorgeous up there, but chilly, but gorgeous and sunny. And she says, "So what color is your sweater?" And I was like, "That's a weird question. It's like charcoal gray." And she's like, "Okay, so maybe we can use this as an example. Are you using black and white thinking about your process and your journey and your relationship that we were discussing?" And I was like, oh, I mean, I'll never forget that sweater. I'll never forget that moment. I'll never forget that conversation. Very much a cognitive behavioral tool and premise and framework and theory. But what she was trying to bring forth for me was one of my limitations that I was encountering on my journey to wellness. I was able to see it and then use a piece of my clothing to help me grasp it.
Do you find that in most of the people that you encounter, they have a very black and white view on what their mental wellness and emotional journey or emotional health journey should look like? They try to relate it to like, well, okay, I see someone doing X, Y, and Z. That's what my emotional health should be. That's what my journey should be. How did you navigate?
Sure. So again, great question. So I think the way that I have processed that is, so I had a lot of abuse in my early childhood days from my family dynamic. And I would say mental abuse, emotional abuse, verbal abuse, physical abuse, almost all the abuses. As a result of that, I had a very perfectionistic way of thinking.
Mm-hmm.
Like, I definitely had straight A's. My hair was always perfect. My weight was perfect. My room was perfect. My car was perfectly detailed. I mean, at 16, everything was perfect. So perfectionism was one of the coping mechanisms from a dysfunctional family in my journey.
Mm-hmm.
And so what she was identifying to me was one of the ways that I was thinking, it's perfect or it's a failure. And basically, in my mind, that was my personal unique definition of black and white thinking. And so if I wasn't in completely engaged or where I wanted to be, then it was, even if it was a 98%, that was a fail.
Mm.
So and that would be the black and white she was referring to for me. So I'd say that in most clients, when they have the shoulds, a likelihood that there's a strong tendency for perfectionism.
Mm-hmm.
And that usually stems from a parent who had unrealistic expectations and or an abusive environment that was invalidating a child's healthy development. Because making mistakes at any age is a part of a healthy development. But if you don't have a healthy framework or family support system who can embrace those mistakes, whether it's like falling down on your bike and eating it, or whether it's like not getting 100% on every, assignment, or whether it's not like having the coolest friends, or whatever, every individual experiences in those early days.
Mm-hmm.
It often will manifest in a black and white thinking pattern. That will be a part of it. It will be a puzzle piece.
Did you have any other coping mechanisms that you had that manifested later on as well, besides perfectionism?
So I'm going to give you a very clinical response to this question, because I think this is it would be the most valuable way to explain it for other people who might be listening. So as a clinician, whether it's myself as the client or I'm with a client. So when I was the client, or when I am dealing with current clients in a clinical lens, we as a clinician use the DSM, which is the diagnostic just the DSM-5. It's just the manual we use. It's a tool we use to help identify anxiety disorders and all these disorders that we label people with,
Mm-hmm.
which simply are to provide understanding to help then create a treatment plan to create a healthy person. That's the goal. Unfortunately, society has taken these labels, multiple personality disorders, and that's an old term, but I'm just going to use it because it's commonly known,
Mm-hmm.
or bipolar disorder, or other disorders that are commonly known in many, many different anxiety disorders, but generalized anxiety disorder is really common. OCD, obsessive compulsive disorder, all of these disorders that are very, very, very common with clients are manifested across the population. All of us have them. So the symptomology, it's all there. We have it like 0.01%.
Yeah.
So it's not seen. Does that make sense? It's a statistical bell curve. So I guess what I want to say to people is in this respect is we all have a little bit of all of those coping mechanisms. We all have a little bit of those patterns. We all have a little bit of pinpointed in the DSM manual.
Mm-hmm.
That's good to know, and that's a good guideline. But what is really important to hone in, whether you're working with a coach or a therapist, clinician, or an MD or a psychiatrist, or any other mental health care worker, finding what's hindering you and it's manifesting so strongly that it's actually creating obstacles for you being whole, healthy, and well. So for example, I'm going to use panic attacks. If someone's having panic attacks, which means they're literally overcome with fear, everyone has a little bit of anxiety. We all have test anxiety. We have, getting your driver's license, we get nervous.
Mm-hmm.
A little bit of anxiety would be a normal human response. But when we have full-blown panic attack, that response is now so loud, it needs tending to. And so I feel like it's really important for people who are on this wellness journey to not get caught up in the labels and the coping mechanisms and the diagnosis, as much as it is to figure out what the problem is and then create a treatment plan if you're working as a clinician or with a clinician, or if you're working with a coach, to create next action steps to help maneuver around that obstacle, around that fear that's creating the panic attack,
Mm-hmm.
so that one can move forward and face their fears, or let go of their fears, or cry their fears out, or however it needs to be process those fears deeply and move forward. So to answer your question, what I'm saying is there are so many different coping mechanisms that we have. And if I use myself as an example, I probably had over 50 different coping mechanisms, but some of them I might have used one time on one level or another, with my eating, with my exercising, with my academics, with my work. I mean, if you look at my resume or my biography on my website, I'm extremely accomplished because my perfectionism has driven that.
Mm.
So, and that leads me to another really important point, is not all of these tendencies that were, quote unquote, as a result of dysfunctional families are negative. They have a purpose. They serve a purpose, but when they're no longer helpful, they become hurtful. that's when it's time to become aware and let them go.
But I think a lot of
Yeah.
people can honestly resonate with that because we all have different coping mechanisms, you're right. And some are necessary for a short moment, and then they can become hurtful and detrimental. I was going to ask you, what led you into becoming a therapist? How did you get into that?
Yeah. So as I said earlier in the story, my journey for understanding myself and my own experience, I want to say that I was probably a philosopher in another point in another lifetime or something. So I wanted to understand it on a macro scale. I wanted to understand it on a micro scale within myself. And then I wanted to master it. Like it was my like clear intentions. It's really interesting. I'm like thinking, how did it evolve? So I started out in therapy at 15 without my parents knowing. I was in therapy for years and they never knew at all.
Oh, wow.
And then years, no clue. And then because I knew it was against the cultural norms, they would say, what's wrong with us? We messed you up. Like they would take it personal when it wasn't about them. It was about me. Like I just wanted to have a greater understanding of myself. I mean, and I'm sure some of their stuff was going to come up in my therapy or whatever, but that wasn't like my focus wasn't to go there to justify blaming them or whatever.
What gave you the strength to keep going with that, even though it wasn't, part of the cultural norm, like you knew like if you had told your family, they would have said something, but what kept you strong and continually going, knowing that?
My curiosity and my certainty of knowing that I had like a human right to understand myself, like as a child of God, like as a human being, as like someone who was born of the spirit, whatever that might be perceived as. Like I knew I had a right independent of the people around me. And because they were so damn unstable and so dysfunctional at so many different levels, I was able to discredit their resistance or their potential resistance if they found out. I was like, even if they found out, it's only because they know they're crazy. So like, I'm just going to keep going. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
And I say that lightheartedly, just to be clear. Like I say, and when I say the word crazy, I mean, what's normal? Some just a little more than others on all ends. That I think that was definitely my personal motivation. But I'll go back to the question you asked me before. So I ended up going to college and I wanted to be a medical doctor because I thought that would be the best way that I could help others understand their wellness journey, because that's really what I was on for myself. And then as I actually got further along in that and I was doing full-blown molecular cellular biology research and I was like isolating DNA and working on like biomedical implants and such, I went, wait a minute, you know what? I'm missing, like, I'm in a lab, I'm isolated, there's no people. Like this isn't the wellness, like where I thought the wellness journey would take me with biology and doing all the research and stuff. It just didn't land me where I had wanted to be, although it was amazing and rewarding and very, very, very interesting and cool to learn. So I immediately did a double major, and then I moved into social psychology, where I did social psychology research. And social psychology is where you learn about collectivism, individualism, group norms, family norms, why people act the way that they do, and then how we work in a society, like any society. So social psychology is basically like the study of people. And I was like, that's the perfect puzzle piece to add to my biology. And then I got accepted into a clinical PhD program in Stanford that was in Palo Alto. And I moved there, and then I got this opportunity to work on editing, and I completely skipped grad school to do this editing work on a manuscript because writing is my passion. Obviously, books is what led me to this whole journey at 15. And fast forward from my mid 20s to my late 30s, once I had my son, I thought, again, really accomplished. It's amazing, but it really never got to my wellness journey, my degree. So having a 2-year-old and not wanting to be back in the career force, I went and got my master's degree with a 2-year-old. That's where I got my license, my training as a marriage and family therapist and licensed professional clinical counselor.
That's
and
amazing.
so that's what, yeah.
Very, very inspirational. Now with your, emotional wellness, is there anything you do daily that helps you, like, besides going to therapy whenever you go? Is there anything else?
I meditate every single day, at least one time a day, at least. So sometimes it's like 3 or 4, literally. And sometimes it's just like an 11-minute meditation. Other times it's like a 55-minute meditation. And I started out with meditation at 19. One of my psychology professors was a hypnotherapist and did hypnosis workshops. And that was where my meditation journey began. I was 18 or 19 years old. And funny enough, she had like went to high school with my mom. So she was like known by everybody or whatever. And I thought it was so cool. A 4-day workshop, getting hypnotized and doing hypnosis. And I think they do age regression and all this cool stuff that I'd never heard of in my family. Where it started was hypnosis. And then I journal every day. Like I started at age 5 every single day. It's very cathartic for me. I love music. Music is a key component to me, moving through energy, moving through like tough moments, moving through emotional moments, moving through loss, moving through failure, quote unquote failure, moving through my mistakes, moving through parenthood, moving through a pandemic, all these fun things that we've been going through, or at least I've been going through, but I know we're all in the pandemic framework. So meditating is really important. And, as a clinician, I want to say one of the most important things. So staying connected to other human beings that you love is the most important thing for wellness. Most important thing. If you have one healthy attachment in the world, you'll be fine. You'll be fine. People are fine when they have one solid, healthy attachment. It may not be perfect. It may not be like, peaches and keen like every single day, but one healthy attachment where you can talk to, you can communicate, you can experience, you can share love, you can cry, you can laugh, you can be silly, you can dance, whatever, what we need to do to like get through and create and be co-creators of our lives. And so through this pandemic, I think why social media has just been like so important is because it's allowed us to remain in that healthy attachment with those that we love. And hopefully we have healthy boundaries to eliminate those who don't make us feel so good on social media. And move through.
Normally social media was something that I would just stay off of. But now I find that it connects me to the people I care about. So yeah, that it's like an interesting take on social media. Most people are like, social media is bad, but like in this case, it actually is beneficial, and you need it. You need to feel connected to the world in some way, even if it's through your phone for a little bit.
Yeah, and I think a healthy physical attachment in your house, in your life, in person is obviously ideal, obviously. But specific to the pandemic, social media has allowed people to have, Zoom, we're in a sense, I consider Zoom a form of social media. It's a different, it's more of a professional, but it's allowing people to meet in groups and see each other and talk and connect and stay attached. Yeah. And so, with the less professional ones, like maybe Twitter or Instagram or Facebook or, any of the others that are maybe, TikTok, there's some others, that are not more professionally geared. As long as there's as long as we have healthy boundaries, you can maintain very healthy attachments on social media, but boundaries are important. So when people say, oh, social media is bad, it's probably just a projection that they don't have healthy boundaries to eliminate the people that.
Yeah, because now you can just like mute someone or whatever. That was just very helpful. I didn't know that you could do that up until like maybe a month ago. But yeah, now you don't have to, like, you can follow someone, but you don't have to see everything they post. You just put them on mute, which is kind of cool. I do this at the end of every podcast, and it's always different. And so I like this part. But if you were to tell anyone out there listening who has struggled or resonated with anything that you have said, what would you tell them?
To look deeper, to look within themselves, to question why whatever I've said has triggered them, why what I've said bothers them. It's usually going to be something. This is exactly what we do in the therapy room. I would say ask yourself why and look deeper. Walk on it, Peloton on it, whatever it takes. But there's something under that that's more than about me. Yeah, for sure.
Thank you so much for coming on here. I really appreciate it.
Well, thank you so much for having me. It's been so awesome to watch you blossom on your journey. I'm so happy to be able to support you over the last 15 plus years. And it's such an honor now to see you in your purpose and in alignment with helping others to feel less alone and letting them know to reach out and get some help. And we're all on a mental wellness journey, whether we know it or not. And of course, the people who know it and are looking for those resources are always a lot more fun to align with. But in the end, we're all really here as spirits trying to become more whole and learn and grow, become a better version of who we are. So it's awesome that you're creating that through this podcast. And if anyone has questions for me, they can reach out to me on my website at www.hellodulcinea.com or dulcineacontreras.com. And of course, all of my social media is on my website and my emails on my website. My email is therapistdulcinea@gmail.com. You can email me questions or anything, reach out. So thanks for having me. It's been great.
Thank you so much for listening, and remember, you have to go through the eye of the storm to see the clear horizon ahead. Thanks so much, guys, and I'll see you next week.